I wasn't invited to my daughter's wedding in Santorini, the one I helped fund. She called and said, "If you really want to be there, just zoom in on the beach via satellite, huh?" I just said, "Enjoy your day." Next morning, dozens of missed calls. But me, too busy enjoying my spa day to answer. The bank manager looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Mrs. Collins, you understand this is $45,000? To Greece. Are you absolutely certain?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting for confirmation of what might have been the largest single transaction of my life. "Cancel it," I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in years. "Cancel the wire transfer immediately." But let me back up because you need to understand how I got to that moment. Sitting in First National Bank at 3 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, pulling the financial rug out from under my own daughter's dream wedding. You need to understand the 22 years that led to me becoming the kind of mother who would wire $30,000 without blinking, only to yank away $45,000 more when it mattered most. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that mothers deserve respect, not just financial exploitation, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. It started with David's death. Not his actual passing. That was quick, mercifully. But the moment afterward when I realized I was completely alone with two teenagers who were looking at me like I held all the answers to questions I'd never even thought to ask. David collapsed on a Tuesday. Tracy was 15, hunched over algebra homework at our kitchen table, chewing her pencil eraser the way she always did when numbers frustrated her. Luke was 13, supposedly doing English but actually drawing basketball plays in the margins of his notebook. Normal evening, normal family chaos, normal life until it wasn't. "Dad, what's X supposed to equal here?" Tracy asked, not looking up from her textbook. David made this strange sound, not quite a word, not quite a gasp. I turned from the sink where I'd been washing dinner dishes, and he was clutching his chest, his face gray as winter sky. "Call 911, I told Tracy, my voice somehow calm despite the terror flooding my system. "Now." The paramedics worked on him for 47 minutes. I counted every one of them, standing in our driveway watching neighbors gather on their porches, their faces reflecting the same disbelief I felt. 47 minutes of chest compressions and electric shocks and medical terms I didn't understand, all while my children stood behind me asking questions I couldn't answer. "Is Dad going to be okay?" Luke kept asking. "Mom, is Dad going to be okay?" I kept saying yes because what else do you tell a 13-year-old boy watching his father being loaded into an ambulance? What else do you tell a 15-year-old girl whose algebra homework was still spread across the kitchen table where her father had collapsed? But David wasn't okay. The heart attack was massive, they said. Unsurvivable, they said. He was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital, though they didn't tell me that until hours later when the paperwork was complete and the decisions had been made without him. At 37, I became a widow. At 15 and 13, Tracy and Luke became fatherless. And in that hospital waiting room with its fluorescent lights and coffee that tasted like burnt hope, I made the promise that would define the next 2 decades of my life. They would never feel abandoned again. That first night, tucking them into beds they didn't want to sleep in, answering questions about funeral arrangements and life insurance policies that no teenager should have to hear, I looked at their red-rimmed eyes and made my silent vow. I would be everything David had been and everything I had been, multiplied by whatever it took to fill the hole his absence had created. I would be their anchor, their safety net, their unwavering source of love and support and stability and anything else they needed for as long as they needed it. The sacrifices started small and grew so gradually I barely noticed them accumulating. When my colleague Helen invited me to dinner the month after David's funeral, I declined because Tracy had a dance recital. When she asked again 6 months later, I had Luke's baseball playoffs. By the time she stopped asking, I was so deep into my children's lives that my own had become an afterthought. I took extra shifts at Morrison & Associates law firm, working late into evenings that used to be reserved for David and me. The overtime pay went toward Tracy's dance lessons and Luke's baseball equipment and the college funds that suddenly felt more urgent with only one income supporting our family. I became the mother who slept in her car between Luke's away games to save money on hotel rooms, the mother who turned weekend bookkeeping into an art form when Tracy decided she wanted to study abroad. My calculator became my evening companion, its blue digital numbers glowing on our kitchen table as I balanced household budgets against teenage dreams. Every dollar saved was a dollar that could go toward their happiness. Every sacrifice was an investment in their futures. Every personal desire I set aside was proof of how much I loved them. I watched other women my age cautiously re-enter the dating world, heard their stories of awkward coffee dates and renewed romance. I watched them discover pottery classes and book clubs and weekend trips to Portland. I watched them reclaim pieces of themselves that motherhood had temporarily set aside. But I wasn't interested in reclaiming anything. I had found my purpose in their accomplishments, my identity in their happiness. When Tracy made honor roll, I felt successful. When Luke pitched a winning game, I felt victorious. Their achievements became my achievements, their milestones my milestones. My friend Janet, the same Janet from high school who used to skip class with me to smoke cigarettes behind the gymnasium, would tease me about becoming a hermit. "Abby, you need a life outside those kids," she'd say during our rare phone conversations. "They're going to grow up and leave, and then what?" But I genuinely believed this was what love looked like. Complete selfless devotion. Round-the-clock availability. Unlimited financial and emotional support regardless of the cost to myself. I measured my worth as a mother by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice, how completely I could disappear into their needs. 20 years of this pattern created a life where my identity existed solely in relation to theirs. I wasn't Abigail Collins, individual woman with her own interests and desires. I was Tracy and Luke's mom, the one who could be counted on for anything, anytime, no questions asked. Which is exactly why, when Tracy called last March with news of Paul's proposal, I didn't hesitate for even a moment before reaching for my checkbook. "Mom," she squealed into the phone, her voice crackling with joy across the miles between Bend and Portland where she'd built her adult life. "Paul proposed. We're engaged." I actually dropped my coffee mug. My favorite one, the blue ceramic cup Tracy had given me for Mother's Day when she was 12, with "World's Best Mom" painted in her careful cursive. The pieces scattered across my kitchen floor, but I barely noticed the mess. "Tell me everything," I said, sinking into the chair where David used to read his morning paper, where I now ate breakfast alone every day. She described the proposal in breathless detail. How Paul had planned a sunrise hike to Crater Lake, how he'd packed hot chocolate in a thermos and hidden the ring at the bottom, how she'd nearly swallowed it in her excitement. Her laugh bubbled through the phone like champagne, infectious and pure. "And Mom," she continued, her voice shifting to something more serious, more vulnerable, "we're thinking about Greece for the wedding. Santorini specifically. Paul found this incredible villa that overlooks the caldera, and the sunset views are supposed to be absolutely magical." "That sounds perfect," I said, already calculating numbers in my head. "It's expensive," she warned. "Like really expensive. The villa alone is $15,000 for the week, and that's before photography and catering and everything else. I know it's a lot, but Mom, it would be absolutely perfect. It would be the wedding of my dreams." Before she finished explaining the costs, I was already reaching for my checkbook. "How much do you need to get started?" I asked. "Oh Mom, I wasn't asking." "How much, Tracy?" "Well, they want $30,000 to hold the villa and book the photographer and secure the dinner cruise for the reception." "But Mom, I don't expect." "I'll wire it this afternoon." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard her crying. The good kind of crying, the overwhelmed with gratitude kind that made my heart expand until it felt too big for my chest. "Mom, I can't believe $30,000 is so much money." "It's for my daughter's wedding," I said, as if that explained everything. And to me it did. This was what I existed for. These moments when I could make her dreams possible, when my love could take tangible form and create magic in her life. The bank teller asked twice if I was certain about the international wire transfer. $30,000 represented nearly half my retirement savings, money I'd accumulated through 2 decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. But watching Tracy's face on our video call that evening, seeing her tears of pure joy, made every penny feel like the best investment I'd ever made. "You're making my dreams come true," she kept saying. "I'm the luckiest daughter in the world to have a mom like you." And I believed her completely. The months following that initial wire transfer had been pure bliss. Tracy called me almost daily with updates about wedding preparations. her voice animated as she described tasting sessions with Santorini caterers and meetings with photographers who specialized in capturing the island's legendary sunsets. I lived for those conversations, eagerly absorbing every detail about floral arrangements featuring local olive branches and reception venues carved into ancient cliffsides. The photographer showed me pictures from another wedding at our villa. Tracy had gushed during one particular call in February. "Mom, the bride looked like she was floating above the sea. The lighting is absolutely magical during golden hour." I'd started a Pinterest board dedicated to Greece travel tips, bookmarking articles about the best restaurants in OIA and researching traditional Greek customs I might encounter. My coworker Helen commented on how radiant I looked lately, how I seemed to have developed a new spring in my step. "You're glowing, Abigail," she'd said while we organized client files. "This wedding has you absolutely beaming." She wasn't wrong. I felt more alive than I had in years, energized by the prospect of witnessing Tracy's perfect day in that breathtaking Mediterranean setting. I'd even started a modest workout routine, wanting to feel confident in whatever dress I'd choose for the occasion. The local travel agent had become my new best friend as we planned my itinerary, discussing flights and hotel options for the extended stay I'd envisioned. But that Monday morning shattered everything with surgical precision. I'd been reviewing depositions for a particularly complex corporate case when my phone rang at exactly 8:30. Tracy's contact photo, a snapshot of us laughing together at her college graduation, filled the screen, and I answered with the warm enthusiasm that had become my default whenever she called. "Good morning, sweetheart. How are the final preparations going?" The pause that followed should have been my first warning. Tracy typically launched into conversation without preamble, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. This hesitation felt unnatural, calculated. "Hi, Mom," she said finally, her voice carrying an odd formality I'd never heard before. No warmth, no excitement, just businesslike efficiency. "So, we need to talk about something." My coffee mug, the ceramic one with "World's Best Mom," that had become my morning ritual, suddenly felt heavy in my hands. The faded letters seemed to mock me as Tracy continued speaking. "Paul's parents have been really involved in the final guest list review," she said, each word carefully measured. "And the resort has some pretty strict capacity limitations we weren't initially aware of." I set down my mug with deliberate care, my attention now completely focused on the conversation. "What kind of limitations?" "Well, it turns out the villa can only accommodate a certain number of guests for the ceremony itself. The cliffside area where we're doing the actual wedding has safety restrictions, and the Greek authorities are really particular about overcrowding." Something cold began forming in my stomach, but I forced myself to remain calm. "How many people are we talking about?" "That's the thing," Tracy continued, her voice gaining momentum as if she were reading from a script. "Paul's parents are really particular about the guest list feeling exclusive, intimate. They've been in event planning for years, and they really understand how important it is to maintain a certain atmosphere." The word exclusive hung in the air between us like a blade. I found myself staring out my kitchen window at the Oregon rain, watching droplets trace random patterns down the glass while my daughter's words slowly registered. "Tracy," I said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to tell me?" "Look, it's not personal at all," she rushed to explain, her tone brightening with artificial cheer. "But we all think it might be best if you just tune in virtually. You know, technology is so amazing these days. You could probably even zoom in on the beach area via Google Earth. Santorini looks absolutely stunning this time of year." Ha! That laugh. That casual, dismissive laugh that treated my exclusion from her wedding like an amusing afterthought. It echoed through my kitchen, bouncing off the walls where family photos documented decades of shared memories, and something fundamental shifted inside me. The silence that followed felt eternal. I could hear Tracy breathing on the other end of the line, probably wondering why I wasn't immediately reassuring her that I understood, that her happiness was all that mattered, that of course I'd be fine watching from thousands of miles away while strangers celebrated the milestone I'd helped fund. My mind raced through 1,000 different responses. I could demand an explanation. I could remind her of the $30,000 already transferred. I could guilt her about the 22 years of single motherhood, the sacrifices, the endless support. I could cry or shout or beg or negotiate. Instead, something entirely unexpected happened. A profound calm descended over me, the kind of clarity that comes when illusions finally crumble and reality stands naked before you. This wasn't just about wedding guest lists or venue capacity. This was about how my own daughter saw me, as someone whose love was expected but whose presence was optional. Someone whose financial support was welcome but whose actual participation was somehow embarrassing. Mom. Tracy's voice broke through my revelation. Are you there? I know this is probably disappointing, but you understand, right? It's just one day and there will be so many pictures and videos. Her words faded into background noise as I processed the magnitude of what was happening. 22 years of devoted motherhood had led to this moment, being casually dismissed from the most important celebration of my daughter's life while my money remained perfectly welcome to fund it. The woman who had worked overtime to pay for dance lessons was suddenly too embarrassing for the wedding reception. The mother who had driven hundreds of miles to baseball games was somehow inappropriate for a cliffside ceremony. The parent who had wired $30,000 without hesitation was now being asked to watch her daughter's wedding through satellite imagery like some kind of digital stalker. Enjoy your day, Tracy, I said finally, my voice carrying a finality that surprised us both. The words weren't angry or bitter. They were simply true. She had made her choice about what kind of day she wanted, and it didn't include me. So I was choosing to let her have exactly that. Her day, her celebration, her perfect wedding that I would no longer fund or worry about or lose sleep over. Mom, wait, she began, but I was already pressing the end call button. As the screen went dark, I sat in my quiet kitchen listening to the rain against the windows and feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. Absolute certainty about my own worth. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't thinking about what Tracy needed or wanted or expected from me. I was thinking about what I deserved. And I deserved better than this. The afternoon stretched ahead of me with unprecedented calm. I spent it doing ordinary things. Folding laundry, organizing my spice cabinet, watering the houseplants I'd neglected during months of wedding excitement. Each mundane task felt revolutionary because I was performing it without the constant anxiety of waiting for my phone to ring with another crisis to solve. Around 4 o'clock I was alphabetizing my tea collection when I heard a car door slam in my driveway with enough force to rattle the windows. Heavy footsteps stomped across my porch, followed by the familiar sound of my front door being flung open without so much as a knock. Luke filled my doorway, his face flushed red from either anger or the drive from Portland, probably both. At 29 he still possessed the same energy he'd had as a teenager when things didn't go his way. That restless intensity that used to send him pacing around our house until I fixed whatever had upset him. Tracy's losing her mind, he announced without preamble, stepping into my living room like he owned it. The resort's been calling every hour since this afternoon. The payment didn't go through, and they're threatening to cancel everything if they don't receive the balance by tomorrow. I continued organizing my tea boxes with deliberate precision, placing the chamomile next to the Earl Grey, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple act of creating order. That sounds stressful for her, I said without looking up. Luke stopped his restless movement, clearly expecting a different response. Mom, did you hear what I said? They're going to cancel the wedding. I heard you perfectly. I moved on to the green teas, arranging them by caffeine content. Ceylon Jasmine Sincha. The wedding planner is having a complete breakdown, he continued, his voice rising with each word. She's threatening to drop them as clients. Paul's parents are furious. They think Tracy's family is unreliable, that we can't manage our finances properly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Paul's parents, who had deemed me unworthy of attending their son's wedding, were now questioning my family's financial responsibility while depending on my money to fund their perfect celebration. They've already told half their friends about this amazing destination wedding, Luke pressed on. Paul's entire business network is expecting to attend. If this falls through, it's going to be humiliating for everyone involved. I placed the last tea box in its designated spot and turned to face my son directly. Really looked at him for the first time in years, studying the man he'd become. When had his default expression become one of entitled expectation? When had he learned to storm into my home making demands instead of requests? Not my problem, I said simply. The words hung between us like a foreign language. Luke's mouth actually fell open, as if I'd just declared my intention to join the circus or become a professional skydiver. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like panic. "What do you mean, not your problem?" he sputtered. "You can't just back out now. You made a commitment." "Actually, I made a gift," I corrected. $30,000, given freely to help fund what I thought would be a celebration of our family. I never committed to funding a party I wasn't welcome to attend. Luke began pacing my living room with the same restless energy he'd displayed as a child, wearing a path between my coffee table and bookshelf. "You're being ridiculous about this whole guest list thing. It's not personal." "Excluding your mother from your sister's wedding isn't personal?" I asked, genuinely curious about his logic. "It's just, Paul's parents have specific ideas about how these things should go. They're paying for part of it too, so they get a say." "Are they paying $45,000? I asked. Luke's pacing faltered. "What 45,000? "The amount I was scheduled to wire tomorrow to cover the venue balance, catering, and honeymoon flights. The amount that apparently became unnecessary when I became unnecessary." "Mom, you're supposed to help," he said, his voice taking on the whining quality it had possessed when he was 12 and didn't get his way. "Tracy's counting on you. She's always been able to count on you." The phrase struck me with perfect clarity. Supposed to help. Not asked to help, not invited to participate in a meaningful way, supposed to. As if my financial support was an obligation, a utility bill that automatically came due regardless of how I was treated. "I helped plenty," I replied, meeting his increasingly desperate gaze. "I funded her fantasy until she decided I wasn't good enough to be in the photos." Luke's manipulation tactics shifted gears with practiced efficiency. He softened his voice, trying the reasonable approach that had worked so well over the years. "Look, I know Tracy's message was hurtful. She didn't express herself well. But you know she loves you, right? She's just stressed about the wedding planning, and Paul's parents have been putting a lot of pressure on both of them." When I didn't immediately cave to his gentler tone, he switched back to aggressive pleading. "Mom, this is her dream wedding. You know how much this means to her. You've always supported us when it mattered most." I watched him cycle through these familiar patterns: aggression, guilt, reasonable explanation, emotional manipulation, and realized with startling clarity how thoroughly I'd trained my children to see me as an endless resource rather than a person deserving of basic respect. "Luke," I said quietly, "I need you to leave now." He stopped pacing mid-stride. "What?" I said, "I need you to leave. This is my home and I don't want to continue this conversation." "Mom, you can't just." "I can," I interrupted, walking to my front door and holding it open. "And I am." Luke stared at me as if I'd sprouted wings, clearly struggling to process this version of his mother who had boundaries and enforced them. "But the wedding is not my responsibility to fund or fix or worry about. Not anymore." "Mom, please. Tracy's going to be devastated if this falls through. Think about what this will do to her." "I've spent 22 years thinking about what everything would do to Tracy and you," I replied. "Today I'm thinking about what this conversation is doing to me. And what it's doing to me is making me tired and sad and disappointed in the people I raised." Luke shuffled toward the door with obvious reluctance, still searching for the magic words that would make me fold. "This isn't like you, Mom. You don't just abandon family when they need you." "You're right," I agreed. "I don't abandon family. But apparently family abandons me when it's convenient. Have a good evening, Luke." As he stepped onto my porch, I closed the door firmly behind him and turned the deadbolt. The click echoed through my house with the finality of a gavel, marking the end of an era where my children's wants automatically superseded my own needs. Through my front window, I watched Luke sit in his car for several minutes, probably on the phone with Tracy, probably strategizing their next approach. But for the first time in decades, their planning didn't involve me rushing to fix their problems. Instead, I went to my kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. That cup of tea became a ceremony of sorts, marking the beginning of something I'd never experienced before: complete peace in my own home. I sat at my kitchen table watching the steam rise from the ceramic mug, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't planning how to fix someone else's crisis or calculating how much money I could transfer to solve another problem. The evening passed in blissful silence. No phone calls, no emergency visits, no guilt-laden text messages. I made myself a simple dinner, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, and ate it slowly, actually tasting the food instead of inhaling it between crisis management sessions. I opened a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir that had been collecting dust in my cabinet, a gift from a client last Christmas that I'd been saving for a special occasion. Apparently, choosing myself was special enough. That night I slept deeper than I had in years. No tossing, no turning, no checking my phone every hour for family emergencies. When I woke naturally at sunrise, my body felt different, lighter somehow, as if I'd been carrying physical weight I hadn't even realized was there. The morning light streaming through my bedroom windows looked cleaner, more golden. I made coffee in my favorite mug and stepped onto my back porch, where the Oregon mist was rising off the Cascade Mountains like something from a fairy tale. For the first time in decades, I wasn't immediately reaching for my phone to check for overnight crises or planning my day around someone else's urgent needs. The peace was so profound it almost felt foreign. I spent that Tuesday morning doing something revolutionary, absolutely nothing productive. I sat in my garden, drinking coffee and watching my neighbor's cat stalk invisible prey through the hostas. I read 3 chapters of a novel I'd been trying to finish for 6 months. I called my friend Janet and actually accepted her invitation for lunch instead of declining because someone might need me. It was nearly noon when I finally turned my phone back on, bracing myself for the digital avalanche that awaited. The screen exploded with notifications like a slot machine hitting jackpot. 37 missed calls. 23 text messages. For voicemails. Tracy's contact photo appeared repeatedly in the call log, interspersed with Luke's number and several unknown international digits that I assumed belonged to frantic wedding vendors. The text messages told a fascinating story of escalating panic. Tracy's first few messages, sent around 10 p.m. the previous night, carried the indignant tone of someone unaccustomed to being told no. "Mom, what is wrong with you? This is so unfair. You're ruining everything. I can't believe you would do this to me." But as the night wore on and the reality of cancelled vendor contracts set in, her tone shifted dramatically. By midnight, desperation had crept into her messages. "Mom, please, we can talk about you attending now." The words that had been so casually denied 12 hours earlier were suddenly on the table, offered like a generous concession from a benevolent ruler. Another message read, "I didn't mean it like that. Paul's parents are upset. This whole thing is falling apart." The blame shifting was remarkable in its transparency. Somehow, her cruelty to me had become about Paul's parents' feelings, as if she were the victim of their unreasonable expectations rather than the architect of my exclusion. The final message, sent at 3 a.m., revealed the full scope of her panic. "Please. If you really love me, you'll help fix this. I'm your daughter. Family helps family." Love as emotional blackmail reduced to its most transactional form. If I really loved her, I would continue funding a celebration that explicitly excluded me. The manipulation was so transparent I almost admired its audacity. I deleted the messages without responding and decided to treat myself to that spa retreat I'd impulsively booked the day before. Driving to Sunriver Wellness Lodge felt like a pilgrimage toward a new version of myself. The 40-minute drive through Central Oregon's pine forests gave me time to process the magnitude of what I was doing. For the first time in 22 years, I was choosing my own comfort over my children's convenience. At the lodge's front desk, I deliberately left my phone in the car's glove compartment and informed the receptionist that I was completely unreachable for the next 48 hours. "First time choosing yourself?" she asked with the knowing smile of someone who'd witnessed this transformation countless times before. I nodded, suddenly emotional at having my journey recognized so clearly by a stranger. My suite overlooked a serene pond where great blue herons stood motionless among the cattails, their reflections creating perfect mirror images in the still water. As I slipped into the plush spa robe and felt the Egyptian cotton against my skin, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something purely for my own pleasure, without any ulterior motive or obligation to others. The eucalyptus-scented air filled my lungs as I walked through corridors lined with soft instrumental music and natural light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. Every detail, from the heated bamboo floors beneath my feet to the infinity pool overlooking the forest, felt like luxury I didn't deserve, until I remembered that deserving had nothing to do with it. This wasn't just a spa day. This was an act of rebellion against 20 years of self-denial, a declaration that my comfort mattered as much as anyone else's. The hot stone massage appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. As I lay face down on the massage table, listening to the gentle sounds of flowing water and wind chimes, Maria began placing heated basalt stones along my spine. The warmth seemed to penetrate deeper than muscle tension, melting away layers of accumulated stress I'd been carrying for decades. "Let it go," Maria whispered when she noticed tears slipping through the face cradle. "Whatever you're holding on to, let it go." 20 years of carrying everyone else's emotional weight was literally being massaged out of my body. I thought about all the sleepless nights spent worrying about Tracy's college applications while ignoring my own health. All the overtime hours worked to fund Luke's baseball equipment while my own retirement savings dwindled. All the personal dreams I'd set aside because someone else's immediate needs seemed more important. In that dim, peaceful room, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the gentle sounds of healing, I finally understood the difference between love and enablement. Love doesn't demand that you erase yourself to prove your devotion. Love doesn't exclude you from celebrations you made possible. Real love invites you to the table you helped set, values your presence as much as your presence. For the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about what crisis might be unfolding in my absence. Whatever was happening with Tracy's wedding would happen with or without my intervention. And for these precious 48 hours, that was perfectly fine with me. When I returned from my spa retreat, the world felt fundamentally different. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had changed. The same Oregon landscape greeted me. The familiar pine trees lining Highway 97, the distant peaks of the Cascades, the red volcanic soil that made this place home. But I saw it all through new eyes, eyes that belonged to a woman who had finally remembered she mattered. My phone had remained blissfully silent during those 48 hours of digital silence. No emergency calls, no family crises requiring immediate intervention, no guilt-laden messages demanding my attention. The absence of chaos was so profound it felt almost surreal. 3 days after my return, while I was organizing my kitchen spice rack, an oddly satisfying task I'd been putting off for months, there was a soft knock at my front door. Not the aggressive pounding Luke had delivered, but something tentative, almost apologetic. I opened it to find Sofia Martinez standing on my porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Tracy's best friend since middle school had always been a sweet girl, but now she looked genuinely uncomfortable, clutching her purse strap like a lifeline. "Hi, Mrs. Collins," she said, unable to meet my eyes directly. "I know this is really weird, but Tracy asked me to come talk to you." The fact that Tracy was now sending intermediaries spoke volumes about how desperate the situation had become. I invited Sofia in, curious about what version of events she'd been told, and put the kettle on for tea. "Tracy's having a really hard time," Sofia began as we settled into my living room. "She's been crying for days. The whole wedding thing has just fallen apart." I poured steaming water over chamomile tea bags, the familiar ritual keeping my hands busy while she spoke. "Tell me what's happening." Sofia's account painted a picture of complete chaos. The villa management company in Santorini had cancelled their reservation when the payment deadline passed. The photographer had booked another wedding for their dates. The dinner cruise company had released their boat to other clients when the deposit bounced. Even the florist had moved on, selling Tracy's specially ordered olive branch arrangements to a different bride. "Paul's parents are furious," Sofia continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They're saying Tracy's family can't manage their finances properly, that this whole thing reflects poorly on their son. They're threatening not to attend any wedding at all now." I felt a strange detachment as she described the domino effect of cancelled vendors and angry relatives. This was exactly what happened when you built dreams on other people's money while treating those people as disposable. The foundation crumbles and everything collapses. "Tracy's been calling vendors all week, begging them to give her another chance," Sofia explained. "But most of them won't hold dates without payment, and the ones that will are asking for double deposits because she's already defaulted once." The irony was exquisite. Tracy, who had deemed me unworthy of attending her wedding, was now discovering that exclusion worked both ways. Vendors who had been eager to work with her when my money backed the project were suddenly unavailable when that financial foundation disappeared. "She asked me to ask you." Sofia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her role as messenger. "Is there anything she could say or do to make things right? Any way to fix this?" I poured myself more tea and considered the question seriously, giving it the thoughtful attention Sofia deserved even if Tracy didn't. "No," I said finally. "There isn't." Sophia looked confused, as if she'd expected anger or a list of demands for groveling apologies. Not even if she apologized? Really apologized? I shook my head, feeling remarkably peaceful about my decision. Words are easy, I explained. Love isn't supposed to come with terms and conditions. You don't exclude your mother from your wedding and then ask her to fund it when your other plans fall through. I could see Sophia processing this logic, perhaps recognizing its fundamental fairness despite her loyalty to Tracy. Her next question surprised me with its insight. Do you think she really understands how much she hurt you? I considered this carefully. I think she understands that her actions had consequences she didn't expect. Whether she understands the emotional damage she caused is something only time will tell. She keeps saying she didn't mean for things to turn out this way, Sophia offered weakly. I'm sure she didn't, I agreed. But intent doesn't erase impact. I spent 22 years teaching my children that my love was unconditional and my money was always available regardless of how they treated me. That was my mistake, and I'm not going to compound it by rescuing them from the consequences of their choices. Sophia nodded slowly, respectfully. When she squeezed my hand goodbye and said, "You deserve better, Mrs. Collins," I knew she understood something about healthy boundaries that Tracy had never learned. A week later, Luke called with an update I hadn't requested. The Santorini wedding was officially dead, impossible to resurrect without the financial foundation they'd rejected along with my presence. They'd scrambled to organize something local instead, eventually settling for a ceremony in Paul's cousin's backyard in Hillsborough. It's not what she wanted, Luke said, his voice carrying that familiar accusatory undertone suggesting this disappointment was somehow my fault. But it's what she chose, I replied calmly. He described folding chairs on uneven grass, a potluck reception organized by relatives, and Paul's parents looking mortified throughout the entire affair. Tracy had worn a simple dress from Nordstrom Rack instead of the designer gown she'd planned for Greece. The photography was handled by someone's teenage nephew with a digital camera from Costco. I wasn't invited to this backyard wedding either, which actually came as relief. The whole event sounded chaotic and resentful. Exactly the kind of gathering I was grateful to avoid. She kept looking around during the ceremony, Luke added, perhaps hoping to guilt me with this detail. Like she was waiting for someone to show up. That sounds difficult for her, I said, meaning it sincerely without feeling responsible for her emotional state. As Luke continued describing the wedding's various disappointments, I found myself thinking about the evening ahead. Thursday night yoga class, followed by dinner with Margaret and her book club friends. We were discussing a novel about a woman who rebuilt her life after her family abandoned her, and I was curious to hear their thoughts on the protagonist's journey. It struck me that I had become the protagonist of my own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's drama. And that felt exactly right. 6 months had passed since that life-changing phone call, and I was driving back to Sunriver Wellness Lodge on the exact anniversary of Tracy's cruel dismissal. This time the journey felt entirely different. Not an escape from crisis, but a pilgrimage to celebrate how far I'd traveled. The autumn landscape rolling past my window reflected my internal transformation. The aspen trees had turned brilliant gold, their leaves catching the late afternoon sunlight like scattered coins. Everything felt more vivid now, more present, as if I'd been viewing the world through fog for decades and only recently discovered I needed glasses. My phone sat peacefully in the passenger seat, face down and silent. No anxiety about missed calls or family emergencies. The woman driving this car was someone I'd only recently come to know. Someone who could disappear for a weekend without worrying about who might need her financial or emotional rescue. At the lodge, I requested the same suite I'd stayed in during my first transformative visit. The receptionist recognized me, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Collins. Welcome back. You look wonderful, absolutely radiant." And I did feel radiant. The chronic tension I'd carried in my shoulders for decades had melted away through months of yoga and massage therapy. My face had softened without the constant worry lines that used to define my features. I'd started wearing colors again. Deep purples and forest greens that brought out my eyes instead of the beige and gray uniforms of invisible motherhood. As I settled into my suite overlooking the pond where herons still stood in patient meditation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The woman who had checked into this room 6 months ago had been running from pain. This woman was running toward joy. That evening, I made my way to the mineral bath as twilight painted the Oregon sky in shades of lavender and gold. The heated water embraced me like an old friend, and I closed my eyes, letting the minerals work their healing magic on muscles that no longer carried other people's burdens. I thought about the philosophy that had emerged from these same waters during my first visit. If my love isn't worthy of a seat at your table, my money won't fund the meal. Those words had become my North Star, guiding every relationship decision over the past 6 months. The principle had been tested more than once. Luke had called in July with news that his startup was failing and he needed a loan to keep it afloat. The old me would have been writing a check before he finished explaining his business plan. The new me listened with sympathy and offered emotional support while keeping my checkbook firmly closed. "But Mom," he'd said, clearly expecting the familiar pattern of automatic financial rescue, "I could pay you back with interest." "I'm sure you could," I'd replied calmly. "But I've decided to reserve my financial support for people who also value my emotional presence." The silence that followed told me he was processing this new reality. A mother who had boundaries and enforced them consistently. Tracy had made her own overtures toward reconciliation, though they all involved requests for financial assistance disguised as family obligations. Christmas gifts for her in-laws. A down payment on a house she couldn't afford. Emergency veterinary bills for the dog she'd impulsively adopted. Each request was wrapped in emotional manipulation. Subtle hints about how her marriage was struggling, how Paul's parents still questioned our family's stability, how a mother's love should be unconditional. But I'd learned to translate this language. What she really meant was, "I need your money but I still don't want your presence." My responses had become beautifully consistent. "That sounds challenging. I hope you find a solution that works for your family." No offers to help. No suggestions for solving her problems. No availability to be used as an emotional or financial dumping ground. Just polite acknowledgement followed by conversation about my own life. My book club's latest selection, my upcoming hiking trip, the pottery class I'd started taking on weekends. The most revealing moment had come during our last conversation 3 weeks ago. Tracy had called supposedly to check on my health, but within minutes she was describing her latest crisis. Something about needing money for marriage counseling because Paul was threatening divorce. "You know," she'd said in a tone dripping with manufactured vulnerability, "sometimes I wonder if things would be different if you'd been at the wedding. Maybe Paul's parents would have a better impression of our family." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost comical. She was trying to make me feel responsible for her marital problems while simultaneously suggesting that my absence, which she had orchestrated, was somehow my fault. "That's an interesting theory," I'd replied evenly. "Have you considered that authentic relationships aren't built on false impressions?" The conversation had ended shortly after that and I hadn't heard from her since. Now, soaking in these healing waters under a canopy of stars, I felt nothing but gratitude for that painful awakening. Tracy's cruel dismissal had been the catalyst I'd needed to examine patterns I might have accepted forever. She'd forced me to confront the difference between being loved and being used, between family and transaction, between generosity and enabling. The smile that spread across my face as I floated in the mineral-rich water wasn't vindictive or petty. It was the smile of a woman who had finally learned to choose herself without guilt or apology. While Tracy dealt with the ongoing consequences of building relationships on manipulation and entitlement, I was here in healing waters, surrounded by peace I had created through healthy boundaries and self-respect. I thought about what might be happening on some distant Greek beach if my original plans had unfolded. Tracy's dream wedding funded by my sacrifice while I watched from the sidelines like a discarded prop. That version of events felt like someone else's life now, a story I'd outgrown through wisdom and growth. The water held me as I processed the full scope of my transformation. The woman who had funded her daughter's fantasy while accepting exclusion from it no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that love without respect is worthless, that generosity without gratitude is enabling, and that setting yourself on fire to keep others warm leaves everyone cold in the end. As I prepared to leave the mineral bath, I made a silent promise to the woman I'd become. I would never again confuse being needed with being valued, or mistake financial dependency for emotional connection. My warmth was mine to give freely or withhold wisely, and I had finally learned the difference. The stars reflected in the water like scattered diamonds and I was whole. If this story of quiet revenge had you feeling empowered, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Abigail calmly said, "Enjoy your day, Tracy," and hung up, knowing exactly what was coming next. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.